30%. And
Trump has made it his mission to go after any country not dancing to his tune.
These are articles over the last few
For
days.
South Africa, it's the white genocide allegations, the expropriation law and its genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice that landed it in Trump's bad books. Lindosipo Bati is a South African car parts supplier. He trades in Bumper Grill, an American company which sells to the European market.
When things started with Trump, then this product was affected as well. Then the sales started to decline. So with that decline, we had to then reduce the labor workforce.
His worst fear was retaliatory tariffs by the EU on Washington. While that didn't happen, his business has still taken a knock.
From the previous months, we've been running around about a month, about 10,000 pieces. And
on the sidelines of the G20, it announced its commitment to start implementing zero tariffs on South Africa. But businesses will have to meet China's strict quality and certification requirements before they can access its market. Pretoria is strengthening its ties with other countries as well. It's talking to regional blocs to boost intra-African trade, currently at just 17% according to UN data, and putting a greater emphasis on its BRICS partners.
The uncertainty of the new trading regime negatively affected employment levels in my own country, South Africa, and is an obstacle to our economic growth. We are therefore supportive of meaningful BRICS initiatives that improve the resilience of our economies as BRICS countries and those of the Global South.
African countries find themselves at the center of a geopolitical tug of war, with 30% mineral reserves and the fastest growing youth population.
The Chinese and the Americans and the Arabians and the Middle East and the Russians and all of Europe, everyone has an interest in African interests and African minerals and resources. I think the issue is for the African nations to see which is the best partner, in particular at the AU level.
The screen went red before the anchors found their words. Not the polished red of a network logo, but the raw, flashing red of emergency graphics, alarms layered over each other, stock tickers stuttering as if they themselves were panicking. In New York, traders froze mid-shout. In Washington, phones rang unanswered. Somewhere between disbelief and denial, a single line of text cut across the world's financial consciousness like a blade. South Africa exits dollar settlement. Switches to China's CIPS. For a moment, the world forgot how to breathe. Then the United States exploded. Inside glass towers overlooking Manhattan, men and women who had spent decades believing the dollar was gravity itself stared at their screens as if reality had cracked. This was not supposed to happen like this. Not openly, not boldly. Not from a country that had learned, for generations, to survive within the system rather than challenge it. On cable news, voices overlapped, analysts shouting over one another, words like unthinkable, reckless, and geopolitical suicide hurled into the air. The markets trembled, not collapsing, but shuddering with a new emotion they hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. In Washington, the mood was worse. Emergency meetings were called before the news cycle had even settled. Advisors rushed through hallways with folders clutched tight, eyes darting as if the walls themselves might be listening. The question hung heavy and unspoken in every room. If South Africa could do this, who was next? Across the Atlantic, in Pretoria, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The announcement had been prepared with surgical precision. No grandstanding, no triumphant speeches, just a calm, deliberate statement delivered in a steady voice, the kind that unsettles empires more than shouting ever could. South Africa was exercising its sovereign right, it said, a strategic recalibration, a step toward financial independence. But everyone knew what it really meant. This was a line crossed. For decades, the dollar had been more than currency. It was leverage. It was pressure disguised as stability. It was the silent hand behind sanctions, loans, and conditions. South Africa had lived with it, negotiated with it, bent under it when necessary. Until now, behind closed doors, the decision had not been easy. The risks were enormous. Threats had arrived subtly at first, wrapped in diplomatic language, then more sharply as whispers turned to warnings. Markets would punish you. Investors would flee. Aid would vanish. History had taught African leaders what happened when they stepped too far out of line. But history had also taught them something else. Dependence was its own kind of prison. The final meeting had lasted deep into the night. Ministers spoke quietly, not because they lacked conviction, but because the weight of the moment demanded respect. When the vote was taken, there was no applause, just silence, and then resolve. In Beijing, the response was almost serene. No flashing graphics, no frantic press conferences. A brief statement, measured and composed, welcoming South Africa's integration into China's cross-border interbank payment system. Cooperation, mutual respect, a shared future. The words were simple, but the implications were seismic. CIPS had long been positioned as an alternative, never openly framed as a replacement. It didn't need to be. Systems don't overthrow empires overnight. They wait, they build, they offer options, and when the moment arrives, they are ready. Behind the scenes, phones had been ringing for weeks. Quiet calls between capitals that rarely appeared together in headlines. Johannesburg to Brasilia, New Delhi to Moscow, Pretoria to Addis Ababa. Conversations laced with caution and curiosity. What if? How would it work? What would the cost really be? BRICS was no longer just a talking shop. It was a listening room. Timing was everything. South Africa had not moved in isolation. It moved with awareness that the world was already shifting, that cracks were forming in the old order. Inflation, sanctions fatigue, weaponized finance. Nations were watching others punished not for aggression, but for disobedience. And they were taking notes. In the United States, the narrative machine roared into action. Editorials warned of chaos. Think tanks published urgent reports. Officials reassured the public that the dollar remained strong, unchallenged, eternal. But reassurance sounded suspiciously like insistence. Wall Street didn't like insistence. Traders whispered about exposure, about contagion, about what happened when confidence, the true foundation of any currency, began to wobble. The dollar was still dominant, yes, but dominance was no longer unquestioned, and that alone was dangerous. The IMF convened its experts, scrambling to frame the move as technical, isolated, symbolic at best. A footnote, they suggested. An experiment doomed to reverse itself. But markets have a way of sensing when language is hiding anxiety. Western media followed the script at first. Reckless South Africa, Chinese trap, a nation gambling with its future. But something unexpected happened. The comments sections filled with a different tone. Why should any country be forced to trade in a currency it doesn't control? Why is diversification treated as rebellion? Why is independence only praised when it serves Western interests? Africa was watching too. In Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, Dakar, conversations spilled out of boardrooms into cafes and living rooms. Young economists argued with old bankers. Activists debated policy wonks. For the first time in a long while, the question wasn't about aid or debt relief. It was about choice. South Africa's move wasn't framed as anti-American at home. It was framed as pro-sovereignty, a recalibration toward a multipolar reality. Officials spoke of resilience, of options, of refusing to be cornered in a world that was clearly changing. And change was contagious. In Washington, a senior official slammed a folder onto the table. "They're coordinating," he said, voice tight. "This isn't random." He was right. The calls intensified. BRICS finance ministers spoke in guarded language, but their alignment was unmistakable. No one announced exits. No one declared war on the dollar. They didn't need to. They simply discussed alternatives, settlement systems, trade denominated in local currencies. Every conversation was a small tremor. China watched patiently. It did not gloat. It did not rush. It understood power differently. The future, it believed, belonged to systems that offered stability without coercion, infrastructure without sermons. CIPS was not sold as liberation. It was presented as utility. That made it far more dangerous. The diplomatic standoffs came quickly. Private warnings, public concern, subtle threats of sanctions floated like ghosts. South African diplomats listened politely, responded firmly. They spoke of international law, of fairness, of the right to choose partners. Behind the smiles, everyone knew the stakes. What if the old tools didn't work anymore? As days passed, the initial shock gave way to something more unsettling: normalization. Markets adjusted. Trade continued. South Africa did not collapse. The sky did not fall. And that terrified the establishment more than chaos ever could. Because stability without obedience was the real nightmare. Africa's awakening wasn't loud. It didn't march. It didn't shout slogans. It watched carefully, learned quietly, and asked hard questions. Why must our trade pass through someone else's system? Why must our reserves sit in vaults beyond our control? Why is neutrality treated as hostility? For the first time in generations, those questions weren't dismissed as naive. They were answered with spreadsheets. In think tanks across the West, a new phrase began to appear, whispered first, then typed reluctantly into memos. Fragmentation. The idea that the world could no longer be managed from a single center. That financial gravity might split, not into chaos, but into clusters. Regional systems. Parallel networks. Options. Choice. Late one night, as Washington slept uneasily, a junior analyst stared at a chart and felt something cold settle in his chest. It wasn't collapse he was seeing. It was erosion. Slow, steady, irreversible if left unchecked. Empires rarely fall in explosions. They fade when others stop believing. In Pretoria, the president stood alone in an office lit by the city's glow. The calls had slowed. The threats had softened into concern. Outside, life went on. Taxis honked. Vendors laughed. The world had not ended. He knew this was only the beginning. South Africa hadn't destroyed the dollar. It had done something far more powerful. It had proven that saying no was possible. As dawn broke across the planet, a question echoed from trading floors to village streets, from policy rooms to comment sections. If the rules can change, who gets to write the next ones? And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between markets opening and markets closing, the old order felt something it hadn't felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that waits. The kind that changes everything.